Our next speaker is Jonathan Wells, who is another one of our very highly educated scholars. He has a PhD in theology from Yale and a PhD in biology from the University of California at Berkeley. So we have so many college degrees among our speakers today. They have enormous research for the books that they have presented and a lot of good facts that you need to have when you take similar courses in college. The name of this book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intellectual Design. Please welcome Dr. Jonathan Wells.
Thank you, Phyllis. It's really an honor to be here and to be in the company of all these other authors. A minor correction, the book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intelligent Design. Phyllis said intellectual. I'm not sure that that's a big difference, but that's just so you don't go looking for the wrong book and maybe get a counterfeit imposter or something. Notice that my book is not about evolution. Evolution is not the problem. Actually, evolution means many things, most of which are non-controversial. Evolution can mean change over time. Evolution can mean an evolving constitution. Well, maybe that's controversial. But nobody disagrees with change over time, at least nobody I've ever met. Evolution can mean change within existing species. Again, that's not controversial. People were observing that and indeed producing it for centuries before Darwin came along. We didn't need Darwin to tell us about it. So the problem is not evolution. The problem is more specific, and that's reflected in the title of my book, Darwinism. Darwinism specifically is the idea that all living things are descended from a common ancestor by unguided processes, unguided natural processes, such as accidental mutations and survival of the fittest. That is Darwinism. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem for two reasons. One is it doesn't fit the evidence, so it's a problem for science. What sorts of evidence do you think of when you think of the so-called overwhelming evidence for evolution? Fossils, okay? Fossils are dead things that have turned to stone. They tell us some things about the history of life. But what fossils do not and cannot tell us is how they are related to each other. Imagine, for example, digging up two human skeletons, heaven forbid, two human skeletons in your backyard. There's no way you can tell how those two skeletons may or may not be related to each other. The only exception is if you get DNA out of them and the DNA is identical, then you've got identical twins. But apart from that, you can't tell how they're related to each other. And they're recent, and they're from the same species. When you look at fossils that are from millions of years ago, in some cases, from different species, there's just no way you can connect them in sequences of ancestry and descent. What you do, or what Darwinian biologists do, is they assume that Darwinian evolution is true, and then they impose that on the fossil record and somehow try to get the fossils to fit the picture. Even then, there's a problem. The fossils aren't that accommodating, and actually the fossil record in many respects is a big mess. We think of molecules as evidence for evolution. Well, we can use molecules to trace lineages within existing species, but I said that's not the problem. When we try to connect different species with their molecules, we run into problems. You've maybe heard that we're closely related to chimpanzees because we're 98 or 94 or 96 or 95.5% similar to them in our DNA. The numbers themselves are very slippery. But when you think, DNA has 4 subunits, 4 letters in its code. So any living thing with DNA is going to be at least 25% similar to us. So when you hear somebody say you're 90x% similar to a chimpanzee, you can say, well, I'm also 25% daffodil. It makes just as much sense, or no sense at all. Here's the ultimate problem for Darwinism. Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species. He claimed that he could explain how new species originate. And they originated, he said, by extending what we see happening within species to the creation of new species over millions of years. And what we see happening in existing species is variation and selection. Well, despite what you may have heard or been given the impression of in your classes, no one has ever observed the origin of a new species by variation and selection. They've tried. They've looked everywhere. They've tried to do it in the laboratory. They've watched for decades. They've done it with bacteria, in which you can produce tens of thousands of generations in the lifetime of a particular scientist. And they have never seen the origin of a new species by variation and selection. So the starting point of Darwin's theory has yet to be demonstrated. And from there on, it's speculation. You may have heard that, well, we can mutate things and change their genes and produce new species this way. Again, this is false. I'm an embryologist by trade, and I know that I can do anything I want to, say, a fruit fly embryo, change its genes any way I want. In fact, it's been done. And there are only three possible outcomes: a normal fruit fly, a defective fruit fly, or a dead fruit fly. That's it. So the evidence for Darwinism is much, much, much weaker than you may have heard. The other problem with Darwinism is it's more than a statement about what happens in nature. Its claim to explain these things by unguided natural processes leads to the implication, and many Darwinists have made it, including Darwin himself, that one consequence of this is that the things we see in the world that appear to be designed are not. There really is no design in the world. It's an illusion. Human beings weren't created in the image of God. They weren't created in the image of anything. They just happened. This has serious implications for religion. Now, several speakers, or certainly our first speaker, spoke about the establishment of religion in this country. Well, actually, we do have an established religion in this country, and you can tell by reading the court decisions. And that established religion is, effectively, atheism. And Darwinism is the creation myth of this religion. And it's defended bitterly by its adherents, which is one reason why there's so much heat and so little light on this topic. When I wrote a book 7 years ago, also put out by Regnery, called Icons of Evolution. Didn't talk about intelligent design, which I'll get to in just a minute briefly. All it did was show that the evidences in your biology textbooks for Darwinian evolution are almost without exception either distorted, exaggerated, or actually faked. That's all the book was about. And it earned me an award, which I now have proudly on my wall at home, the most hated man in America. I don't know, maybe you guys are jealous, but we could share it. Johnny Cash is reputed to have said once, it's good to be hated by the right people. Well, I consider myself honored to be in the company of others who are also hated by the right people. But this is a very nasty battle. I printed out some stuff off the internet just a month or so ago on one of the big science blogs, stuff about me, which was so over the top, or maybe I should say under the bottom, that it was unbelievable. And I printed it out and I handed it to my teenage son without comment, just for him to look at. And he sat there and read it for a few minutes. And then he started to laugh because it was so absurd. And the hallmark of these criticisms is, first of all, they don't deal with the evidence. Almost never do you hear Darwinists deal with the evidence, or they deal with it in ways that have already been discredited. What they do is they go after persons. They attack the person. Now, as a former 60s Berkeley radical, I'm pretty thick-skinned. Yes, I'm sorry to say. I've repented. But I am thick-skinned, so I can take the abuse. But it's interesting to me that so much of it is personal rather than intellectually relevant. Now, what is intelligent design? Intelligent design is a new idea, about 15 years old now. It's fairly simple. Intelligent design says, in opposition to Darwinism, some features of the world that appear to be designed may actually be designed. Now, that's revolutionary. I mean, Darwinists consider this a real threat to our civilization. They've written to our civilization, you know, not to their tenure or their research grants, to civilization. But all ID says is that some features may be designed. How do we tell? By looking at the evidence. Intelligent design says we can look at the evidence and determine whether something is better explained as a product of intelligence than as a product of unguided processes. Complexity is not the only hallmark here. Some people say some things are so complex they had to be designed. Actually, there's more to it than that. If I take a handful of Scrabble letters and I drop them on the floor, the pattern, whatever pattern they make, will be very complex. But I don't think anyone would say it's designed. The pattern itself is not designed. But if I take those same letters and I arrange them on the floor to spell out a sentence from Shakespeare, we don't even have to think about it. We immediately look at that and know that that's designed. So the pattern is not just complex, it's also what my colleague William Dembski calls specified. Specified, now that's a concept that's being worked out philosophically by design proponents, but in a living cell it's not hard to understand. If you look at DNA, there's a code in DNA to make proteins. DNA is very complicated, billions of letters in one organism. But they're not arranged haphazardly. They're arranged to specify proteins, very narrowly, proteins that will enable a living cell to survive. That's the specification. So the argument for intelligent design is that we can look at the evidence from biology, and as I'll say in a minute, from astronomy, and see that some things are better explained by design than by unguided processes. But intelligent design says nothing about the Bible. It's not based on Genesis. It doesn't address the issue of the age of the earth. It doesn't say everything is designed. It doesn't tell us who the designer is. Personally, I believe the designer is God, the God of the Old and New Testament. But intelligent design doesn't get you there. It's very simply the statement, we can look at the evidence and determine whether something is better explained by intelligence than by unguided processes. And that alone is enough to provoke the rage of people who are so determined to defend their secular creation myth that they will not, at this point, even allow public discussion of an alternative. Kansas and Ohio, the last few years, passed curricula, biology curricula, science curricula, did not say anything about intelligent design. All the curricula said was that students should learn the evidence for and against Darwinian evolution. That was it. The newspapers said they were trying to teach intelligent design, but that's not true. Much less was it true they were trying to teach the Bible. They were just trying to tell students, you should know the evidence for Darwinian evolution. You should also know the evidence against it. The Darwinists, with help from their allies in the news media, misrepresented the issue, of course, publicly, as the teaching of ID or creationism. And by narrow margins, these people on the school boards in Ohio and Kansas were thrown out of office, and both states have now gone back to students will learn Darwinism, the whole of Darwinism, and nothing but Darwinism in their biology classes. So this is the power of the secular religion that has gripped our culture. I'm going to stop there, but not before I show you my ultimate victory over the Most Hated Man in America award, and that is a Starbucks coffee cup, which quotes from my book. I'll read you the quote. Darwinism's impact on traditional social values has not been as benign as its advocates would like us to believe. Despite the efforts of its modern defenders to distance themselves from its baleful social consequences, Darwinism's connection with eugenics, abortion, and racism is a matter of historical record, and the record is not pretty. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wells, and I hope you have provoked some good questions. His book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intelligent Design, and you're now connected with the Discovery Institute. Why don't you tell us what that is?
Well, thank you. The Discovery Institute, where I am a senior research fellow, otherwise I would be probably bagging groceries at a Safeway somewhere, because American academia will have nothing to do with me. Surprise, surprise. Anyway, Discovery Institute is a public policy think tank in Seattle. Deals with many issues: defense, economics, technology, Seattle area transportation. But the issue that has garnered it worldwide reputation is the Center for Science and Culture, which is the leading international organization studying and promoting intelligent design.
Good. Question?
The first part is, what's your stance on creationism? And the second part is, why do you think the ACLU is so against intelligent design in schools? Thanks.
Creationism, like evolution, is an ambiguous word with many meanings. If all creationism means is God created the universe and got the ball rolling, then Darwin himself may have been a creationist. But normally in the current controversy, creationism refers to those people who think that the first chapters of Genesis should be read literally, especially with regard to their chronology. I am not a creationist in that sense. My feeling is that the chronology is a matter of evidence, and I am not up on it. It's not my field. It wouldn't bother me in the least if the world turned out to be 10,000 years old, but from what I've seen, I think it's probably much older. But that's not part of the debate over intelligent design. Intelligent design does not address that at all. The ACLU, well, I think there are probably people here who know the history of the ACLU far better than I do. But it's no surprise to me that the ACLU should be defending at every turn the secular religion of American academia. It's not just that they're opposed to intelligent design. They are opposed to any criticism of Darwinism in the public schools. They will not tolerate it. If they think they can win a lawsuit on that issue, they do it. So it's not just intelligent design. You cannot criticize our religion.
Hi. How would you deal with an anthropologist who would use the existence of Neanderthals and Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and all those who use that as an excuse for evolution and Darwinism?
Okay, good question. Actually, the fossil record of hominids, as these are called, creatures that have features intermediate between us and apes, is a mess. You may have heard of Lucy, our supposed ancestor. Well, if you put on a grid between age and brain size the so-called ancestors of humans, Lucy is well on the way to being a chimpanzee, not a human. Neanderthals, which lived just a few thousand years ago, had larger brains than we have. So technically, they were more evolved. They were more advanced. So that screws things up right there. And then recently, you may have heard of these hobbits who were found in Indonesia, recent human beings, and apparently they really were human beings, about half the size that we are, with much smaller brains. Now, technically, they should be way down in the ape lineage, and in fact, they're modern humans. So the fossil record, even assuming Darwinism, the fossil record of hominids is a mess. One student of this, who actually is a senior science writer for Nature, who is a thoroughgoing Darwinist, he doesn't question Darwinism, but he acknowledges that trying to put these fossils into some sort of ancestor lineage relationships is scientifically no better than a bedtime story.
I have a question regarding the scientific nature of intelligent design. And because while I certainly appreciate it and agree with it from a philosophical standpoint, I have trouble seeing how it meets the criterion of falsifiability, which I think is necessary for good science, in the sense that due to its very nature, you could never devise an experiment that could possibly ever prove it false. And I was wondering what you think about those sorts of notions regarding intelligence.
Good question. Let me begin by saying most of the claims of Darwinism are not falsifiable by this criterion. But when we turn to intelligent design, falsifiability. The term, I think, originated, or at least was made popular by Karl Popper, who said that the hallmark of a scientific theory is that you can find evidence against it. Any idea you propose, according to Popper, you can come up with all kinds of evidence for it. I mean, astrology has evidence for it. But if it's an idea that you can't prove wrong, then it's not scientific, according to Popper. Okay, and this is debated by philosophers of science. There's a lot of problems because, for one thing, if I said, the moon is made of green cheese, well, that's falsifiable. It has been falsified, but it's a scientific claim according to Popper. So there's a problem with the criteria. But when we look at ID, intelligent design, if I say that the specified complexity of DNA, for example, is best explained by an intelligent cause, that could be falsified if I could show, or somebody could show, that that specified complexity can be caused by random genetic changes and natural selection. And people have tried to do that, and they've been unable to do it. So there we have a testable statement. Another statement by Lehigh biochemist Michael Behe is about irreducible complexity in cells. Irreducible complexity refers to the idea that some features of cells only work when all the parts are in place. If you take away one part, the whole thing stops. Well, natural selection can only work on things that operate, that function. So it can't put the parts together. The parts have to be there before evolution kicks in. And Behe points to several things that have this quality. Well, various people have tried to show that the things he claims are irreducibly complex are not irreducibly complex. And so that's another area where the evidence is brought to bear on ID claims.
Hi. I have found that when visiting museums and zoos, you're just bombarded with a lot of evolution. In fact, the Natural History Museum here in town has an evolution theater. And I feel that this is a tremendous stronghold that Darwinists have in indoctrinating our youth. And I was just wondering if you have any practical ways that we can combat this and win back our culture.
Well, certainly for me as a parent, the most direct way is to educate my kids. My daughter and son have both gone through the public school system, but not without some prompting and coaching from me. Also, I prompt them and coach them to be very cautious in what they say. But we do have to pay attention to our children and try to educate them the best we can in the face of this massive indoctrination effort. The other thing I'll say is when you look at the sources of funding for these places, and this ties into the theme of this entire meeting, it comes from us. All of this is taxpayer funded. Guillermo Gonzalez, whose family fled Cuba years ago, is an astronomer at Iowa State University, was recently denied tenure because he wrote a book in his spare time arguing for, which I didn't get to actually, arguing for intelligent design in the cosmos, put out by Regnery, by the way. Because he wrote this book, even though his publication record is better than his other colleagues who were up for tenure, he was denied tenure. And it's clear from the record that it was this book that torpedoed his chances. This is a public university, supported almost entirely by taxpayers of Iowa and us, the federal government, to the tune of billions of dollars every year. And I think it's up to us to educate the American people to realize how they've been hoodwinked into paying for this huge propaganda machine, including the National Museum of Natural History.
In Pennsylvania, in the Dover School District case, the ACLU was able to persuade the court to censor intelligent design, any mention of intelligent design in the school district. I'd like to comment on that, but I'd like to suggest maybe a different approach. If the courts are going to censor any mention of intelligent design, how about trying this, trying to persuade a school board to shut down the public school for, say, a half a day a week and allow the parents to come in for that half day a week. The school is shut down, and the parents can introduce concepts of intelligent design and abstinence and all sorts of other conservative ideas to the students because the public school is shut down, and then a court can't do anything about it.
Well, that's the first I've heard of that. I have to think about that. Let me say about this Dover decision in Pennsylvania, which was the end of 2005. It actually, I could have spent 20 minutes just on that because it exemplifies many of the themes of this meeting. Here, a federal judge took it upon himself to adjudicate a local education dispute in such a way that he essentially decided for the whole of our culture that intelligent design was not science. Well, Discovery Institute has analyzed his opinion and found that something like 3/4 of it was lifted almost verbatim out of the ACLU's closing remarks. It misrepresents the trial record because he misquotes advocates of intelligent design, including Mike Behe, and yet he decided intelligent design is not science. Well, why is a federal judge deciding what's science and what's not science? I mean, this is ridiculous. And besides, the opinion is just bad even on its merits. Discovery Institute did not actually advise the Dover School Board not to mandate. You know what the Dover School Board did, by the way? It said students should hear a statement at the beginning of biology classes, one class. This is not verbatim, but Darwinian evolution is a controversial theory. If you want to learn about an alternative idea called intelligent design, there's a book about it in the library. That was it. I mean, I quote the whole thing in my book, but that's about it. And the ACLU just jumped on that. But the ACLU has also jumped on school boards, as I say, who just want to teach students that there's a problem with Darwin's theory and say nothing at all about intelligent design. So your idea, I have to think about it. I've never heard that proposed before, but, you know, I think our public schools are in dire need of something to open this indoctrination logjam.
Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.
This is my topic for this evening, Darwinian evolution or intelligent design. As you can see, some of the slides are going to be a little chopped off at the bottom. I actually prepared this for an IMAX theater, but by mistake, and this is the best we could do tonight. Okay, Darwinian evolution or intelligent design. Fact: many features of living things look as though they were intelligently designed. The question I'm going to be asking this evening is a fairly narrow one given the scope of this week's discussions, but it's actually going to turn out to be pretty broad. Is design in living things only an appearance, or are some features really designed? Darwinian evolution concludes the former, that design is only an appearance, and intelligent design theory, which I will be describing in a few minutes, concludes the latter, that design is real. Here's a quote from a prominent defender of Darwinian evolution, Richard Dawkins at Oxford, who actually defines biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. This is an acknowledgement of what I just said, that just about everybody agrees that living things look as though they were designed. But for Dawkins and for defenders of Darwinian evolution in general, the evidence of evolution reveals a world without design, without real design. In science, however, and Darwinian evolution, after all, is supposed to be science, theories are ultimately judged by how well they fit the evidence. So this evening, I'm going to take a look at some of the principal evidences that supposedly reveal a world without design. Before I start on it, though, I'd like to clarify what I mean in this talk by evolution. The word actually has many meanings. It can mean things change over time, history, the evolution of the United States political parties or something like that. In many contexts, it means simply the history of the cosmos. I'm not going to use such a broad meaning, however. This evening I'm going to speak specifically about biological evolution. In fact, biological evolution as described by Charles Darwin about 140 years ago. Darwin himself called his theory descent with modification. This indicates there are two aspects to the theory, the first being descent. And he wrote, "I view all beings not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived a long time ago." The second aspect of his theory, the modification, Darwin attributed to natural selection, or survival of the fittest. And for Darwin, natural selection was the principal, although not the only, means whereby the original ancestor diversified into what we see around us today. Now, it's clear from Darwin's writings that he intended for this theory, or he understood this theory, to exclude design in any particular features of living things. For one thing, he said there's no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. And in perhaps his most succinct and clearest statement of his view, he said, or he wrote, "I am inclined to look at everything as resulting from designed laws." In other words, Darwin was willing to acknowledge that some deity might have designed the universe in the beginning. But for Darwin, once that happened, not only did the deity turn the world loose to operate by itself, but specific results of the biological evolutionary process for Darwin were not designed. That is, the outcome of the process was basically up to chance. So, although he didn't exclude design entirely, it's correct to say that for Darwin, no specific feature of any living thing can be regarded as design. Now, an aside here, to put this in context of some of the other talks that are going on this week. In the Christian tradition, of course, human beings are designed, created in the image of God. For an orthodox Darwinist, this is not the case. Human beings are the accidental byproduct of natural processes which did not have us in mind. That's actually a quote from Darwinian paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson. So there's a conflict here. I'm going to explore Darwin's theory at some length here and some of the major evidences for it to see whether Dawkins's claim that the evidence of evolution reveals a world without design can be upheld. This is the only diagram in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. By it, he intended to show how, if you can look down here at the bottom left, how a single species over time would split and diversify into many different forms. Now, if you look around you here in this room, you can see a lot of variety. Different body builds, skin color, hair color, aptitudes, whatever. This is the variability upon which, for Darwin, natural selection was supposed to work. And according to his theory, if we were to split this group here tonight into two groups and send one to the South Pole and the other to Jamaica, I'll go with the group to Jamaica, then after a few million years, these two groups will look very different from each other. And so for Darwin, this was the explanation of why we get not just different kinds of organisms within a single species, but why we get different species, different genera, different orders, classes, families, and so on, up the ladder, until we get after... Did I just hit something here? Oops. This is not my computer. I'm not used to this. Maybe if I just ignore it. Anyway, after many millions of generations, Darwin wrote, we would expect to find the very great differences that now distinguish, say, human beings from starfish or plants or bacteria. But this would happen only after many, many millions of years. Here we go. Now, this process certainly happens within a species. Okay, we could, if you've ever been around, this is an agricultural school, at least in part, Those of you who are studying agriculture know that it's possible to breed animals and plants so that they change in dramatic ways over many generations. But these are changes within a single species. This sort of descent with modification clearly happens. But it's equally clear that Darwin meant by his book much more than that. After all, he didn't call his book How Species Change Over Time. He called his book The Origin of Species, and he made it quite clear in his book that he intended to explain the entire diversity of all living things on the earth. So let's focus at a specific level in the biological hierarchy to see whether the evidence, as I said, it certainly supports changes within a species. Let's see if it supports, say, Darwin's claim that all animals are descended from a common ancestor. Three of the key lines of evidence that are used to support this claim in biology textbooks and in biological writings in general include fossils, molecules, and embryos, and I'll review each of these briefly in turn. Now remember, we're asking ourselves, are all animals descended from a common ancestor? First of all, we have to realize that there are many different basic kinds of animals. There's several dozen, in fact, depending on whose classification you accept. I've chosen here just 7 representative major groups. The technical name for them is phyla. Another word often used nowadays is body plan. One group is the flatworms, which includes the tapeworms, the roundworms, of which there are millions around the earth, echinoderms, which includes the starfish and sea urchins, chordates, which includes mammals, us, mollusks, which includes snails, clams, and octopuses, arthropods, which includes the crabs and insects, and annelids, which includes earthworms and leeches. These are basically very, very, very different kinds of animals because their bodies are constructed in radically different ways. And as I said, there's several dozen more. I'm just using these 7 as representative examples. Now, in Darwin's theory, if we had a decent fossil record, which we don't, and I'll get back to that in a minute, if we had a decent fossil record, we might expect to find something like this. Way back in the distant past, we have a single kind of animal. Gradually, over time, we get 2 major groups, and then maybe 4. Of course, it wouldn't be as neat as this, and so on, up until the present, where we have the several dozen major groups that we see around us now. When we actually look at the fossil record, what we find instead is this, a phenomenon called the Cambrian explosion, in which most of the major kinds of animals appear at about the same time in a geological instant, fully formed, with absolutely no fossil evidence that they shared a common ancestor. Now, there's 1 or 2 or 3 that appear slightly before that. There's some that appear later. But many, including 6 of the number 5 is in question, but 6 of the 7 certainly that I just mentioned appear simultaneously, geologically speaking, in the Cambrian explosion. So we have here theory and evidence, a striking conflict between the two. Darwin himself was aware of this. He wrote, "The manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the Cambrian, the geological period in which this happens, at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained." Now, Darwin thought the problem would be solved over subsequent decades of research. He hoped that the fossil record would be filled in, and if it didn't get filled in, he thought, well, then it's because the rocks have been deformed, or the fossils were too small to have left, or the animals were too small to have left fossils in the first place. But after 150 years of fossil collecting since the time of Darwin, it's now clear that, first of all, we have many animals not many animals, we have many fossils from before the Cambrian. Many of the fossils that occur before the Cambrian are microfossils, that is, they can only be seen under a microscope. So the idea that they're too small to be found is just not true. The idea that animals were too delicate to fossilize before the Cambrian is also not true, because it turns out that most of the animals in the Cambrian explosion were soft-bodied. Anyway, that's just a summary of arguments used by people nowadays to maintain that the Cambrian explosion is real, that it does constitute a problem for Darwin's theory. Those who hold to Darwin's theory assume that it can still be explained away, but my point here is simply that the fossil evidence for the origin of animals does not fit Darwin's theory of evolution. The second level of evidence, used a lot nowadays, is evidence for molecules. Evolutionary biologists compare similarities among molecules in living organisms. Okay, we can't get molecules, with rare exceptions, from fossil organisms. So we take living organisms and we compare the molecules in them, and based on how similar those molecules are, we make inferences about how closely related these animals are and perhaps how long ago they diverged from a common ancestor. If we go back and look at the 7 representative groups I've chosen here, and we look at a particular molecule that all these animals have, it's called 18S RNA. It's a molecule used in transferring the code from DNA into protein. All animals have to use it, and so all these animals have it, but the molecule differs slightly from one animal to the next, so we can make these comparisons. And when we group these animals, these different groups of animals, according to the similarities in their 18S RNA, we get this grouping. The echinidates are most similar to chordates, arthropods and nematodes, and so on. And what an evolutionary biologist then does is use these comparisons to construct an evolutionary tree. Okay, these 3 are most similar, these 2 and these 2. In fact, the similarity here is greater than the similarities here, so you see it's inferred that the common ancestor of these 2 is more recent. Okay, this is going into the past. It's important to remember here, though, that the only data we have are here. This is all inference. Now, it turns out that these 5 are more similar to each other than any of them is to these 2, so we connect them down here, the idea being that they came from a common ancestor that was still apart from this lineage here, and then finally we work our way back to the hypothetical common ancestor of all of these groups. This is how molecules are used to reconstruct evolutionary lineages. But we run into some problems here. The first problem is when we do this based on 18S RNA and we compare it with the old-fashioned way of constructing these trees, which was based on body shape or anatomy or morphology, we get a conflict. This is the old tree based on anatomy. Here the flatworms and roundworms are together, and the insects and the earthworms. Over here, with 18S RNA, they're grouped differently. Okay, so maybe the molecules are more accurate than the morphology. But if we then look at a different molecule, not 18S RNA, but another one called 28S RNA, we get a different tree again. Okay, here the flatworms and the mollusks are together. Over here, it's the echinoderms and the mollusks. Okay, 18S and 28S. 2 different molecules, we get 2 different results. What's cut off at the bottom of the screen here is the actual scientific reference for this, which I can give you later if you're interested. More striking even than that is that if we take the same molecule, 18S RNA, and we submit it to 2 different labs, we get 2 different results. So here's the same molecule in 2 different labs, giving us 2 strikingly different evolutionary trees. Now, does this refute Darwin's theory of evolution? No, I'm not claiming that it does. But it sure as heck doesn't provide evidence for it. The inconsistencies in these trees must be explained away to reconcile the data with common ancestry. They certainly don't provide evidence for common ancestry. Finally, on the issue of the common descent of all animals, embryos. Now, Darwin, we'll go back to these 7 representative phyla, but this time I'm just going to look at one of them, the phylum to which we belong, the chordates. Now, Darwin was aware of the problems with the fossil evidence, and he, of course, didn't know anything about the molecules. So for him, this was the most powerful evidence for his theory. He wrote, "The embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar, but become, when fully developed, widely dissimilar." He called this by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of my theory. An illustration of what Darwin meant is provided here. It's still used in many biology textbooks. And what we have here on the far right are humans, then 3 other mammals, then birds, turtles, salamanders, and fish. This was done by a German Darwinist in the 1860s, Ernst Haeckel. And the point of the drawing is that when you go back in the early stages of these different animals, their embryos look almost identical. In fact, for Darwin, this gave us some indication of what the common ancestor of these animals actually looked like. The problem is, Haeckel, it turns out, faked his drawings. If we draw embryos from life, as they've been done here, here's a human, a bird, a turtle, an amphibian, and a fish. The differences are striking. It's now acknowledged, widely acknowledged in fact, that Haeckel faked, fudged, doctored. I mean, you can use whatever word you want to depending on how hard you want to slam the guy for this. But the fact is, the pictures he drew don't look like the embryos, and Darwin himself was mistaken. But this isn't even the most serious problem with Haeckel's drawings. Okay, here's the stage that Haeckel misrepresented as the most similar. If you go back earlier in the development of the embryos, I don't know how clearly you can see it here, but the cell division patterns right from the get-go are radically different among these different classes. And the differences continue up until the time the cells begin to move to form this stage, which turns out to be the midpoint of embryo development in vertebrates. This is a quote from this is not a secret, by the way. This was a Dartmouth biologist 25 years ago who wrote, "It's only by semantic tricks and subjective selection of evidence, by bending the facts of nature, that one can argue that the earliest stages of vertebrate embryos are more similar than their adults. It's simply not true." Nowadays, developmental biologists have taken to using what they call the developmental hourglass to represent this. Here, the embryos are very different. They converge to a point where they're vaguely similar here, and this was the point that Haeckel misrepresented to make them look identical, and then they diverge again. This is not the pattern Darwin wanted. It's not the pattern that would provide the strongest single class of facts for his theory. The facts that he relied on, in fact, turned out not to be facts at all. So, to wrap up this section, question, are all animals descended from a common ancestor? Well, the evidence we've seen from fossils, molecules, and embryos is, to put it mildly, far from overwhelming. The second element in Darwin's theory is the mechanism of modification. Now, Darwin knew nothing about genes, as he knew nothing about the molecules. The modern version of Darwin's theory, called neo-Darwinism, adds genetic knowledge to his theory of natural selection, so that now the mechanism of evolution is supposed to be primarily natural selection, or survival of the fittest, acting on random genetic mutations. And some of the major evidences used to support that in textbooks and elsewhere include Darwin's finches, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and four-winged fruit flies, which I'll discuss briefly in turn. First, Darwin's finches. Darwin himself had no evidence for natural selection. He freely admitted this. He used domestic selection, breeding, as an analogy for natural selection, and all he could do in his book was offer what he called one or two imaginary illustrations. Well, we now do have evidence for natural selection, real evidence. Some of the best, in my opinion, comes from Darwin's finches. Now, the name is kind of funny. Darwin's famous trip to the Galapagos. He just about totally ignored these birds. They were named Darwin's finches a century later as a sort of an honor to him, but they had almost nothing to do with the formulation of his theory. But that's an aside. In the 1970s, some Princeton biologists went to the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific here off the coast of Ecuador, and they courageously camped out on a little tiny island down here, Daphne major, to study one species of ground finch, the medium ground finch. Now, it's important to note that these birds are very similar to each other. What did I just leave it alone, right? Then it goes away. There. These birds are very similar. The main difference, the most noticeable difference among them is in the size and shape of their beaks, okay? So Peter and Rosemary Grant and their colleagues in the 70s went to study the medium ground finch, and as luck would have it, luck for them, not for the birds, they actually very carefully described every single bird on the island and kept a log. In 1977, a severe drought hit, killed about 85% of the medium ground finches on Daphne major by destroying the food supply. Those that survived had, on average, slightly larger beaks, which enabled them to crack the hard seeds that survived the drought. Okay, and then they reproduced, and their offspring had, on average, slightly larger beaks. This was natural selection in action. Well, the Grants and others extrapolated from this slight change and estimated that if there were a drought every 10 years or so, the beak would change enough over 200 years so that this would qualify as a new species of finch. Remember, the differences are mainly in the beaks. Problem is, within a year or two, the rains returned, the beaks went back to their previous value, and they've been oscillating back and forth about that value ever since. No net evolution occurred. In fact, chances are if the drought had continued or gotten worse, all of the birds would have died because the island would have become a desert. But that didn't happen because the rains came back. So there's no net evolution here. All we do see evidence of natural selection, but the small reversible effects occurred only within an existing species, just as we see in domestic selection. Minor reversible changes of this kind do not explain the origin of the medium ground finch, much less the origin of beaks, finches, or birds in the first place. All they show us are minor changes within existing species. Let's move to something perhaps a little more, that's had a little more time. We've done a little more research on it. Because of the generation time, bacteria can reproduce every 20 minutes or so. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Oops, I went the wrong way. Yeah. Now, in this cartoon, these are bacterial cells, okay? There's no antibiotic present in this culture, but there is one cell which, let's assume, has resistance to a particular antibiotic. It may have acquired it through mutation or acquired it by getting a gene from another organism. Doesn't matter here. What matters is there's one resistant organism, and when we dose this colony with this antibiotic, the other organisms die. The only one that survives under proper conditions would be the resistant one, which then goes ahead and reproduces and makes more resistant organisms. This is a real pain in the neck for medical practice and hospitals especially, and it happens. Now, what happens if we remove the antibiotic? Well, the wild type or normal bacteria come back, and within a couple of generations, in most cases, they have restored the situation to normal because they're hardier, they're better adapted, generally speaking, than the resistant organism, and so they put things back the way they were. Although the patient may be dead in the meantime, so it's still a serious problem for medical science. But what does it tell us about Darwinian evolution? Not much. It turns out that in 150 years of observing these phenomena, No bacteriologist has ever witnessed the origin of a new species, ever. Like observed cases of natural selection, like Darwin's finches, observed cases of beneficial mutations occur only within existing species. Now, I mentioned that the resistant bacteria might have gotten its resistance through a mutation. But I'm going to say more about mutations now. The mutation that helped that bacterium affected only a single molecule, a molecule involved in the antibiotic pathway. But for Darwinian evolution to happen, we need more than a minor biochemical change. We need a change in anatomy. We need changes that will explain the emergence of multicellular animals, of wings, of feathers, of lungs, and so on. This requires a lot more than changes in single molecules. And one example that's sometimes used to illustrate how this might happen is the four-winged fruit fly. Now, normal fruit flies have two wings. They also have little tiny appendages here behind the wings called balancers that they use to stabilize themselves when flying. But back in the 70s and 80s, a now Nobel Prize-winning geneticist found a way to combine three separate mutations to make a fly with four normal-looking wings. It turns out, however, that what happened is these balancers were transformed into the wings. Without the balancers, however, the fly cannot fly. Furthermore, the new wings, the extra pair, have no muscles, so they're absolutely useless. It's kind of like if you can imagine a Piper Cub or a small private plane trying to take off with an extra pair of wings strapped to its tail dragging on the runway. These flies are very badly adapted. They have trouble flying and mating. In fact, they cannot survive outside the laboratory. So as evolutionary good news, they're not. It turns out that every example of a mutation we know of that significantly affects anatomy produces, like the four-winged fruit fly, an organism that is less fit, not more fit. There is no evidence that I'm aware of, as a molecular biologist myself, that genetic mutations can provide the beneficial changes that we need in evolution. So, this is usually the cash value of all this, human evolution, because this is where we are affected ourselves. What about human evolution? This is adapted from a recent issue of Nature. It shows various fossils. Here's a chimp up here. This is a timeline in millions of years, human. Now, the only parameter in the horizontal axis here is brain size. We all know that there are a lot of things going on with animals besides brain size, but if we just look at brain size, we get something like this. The first odd thing about this, by the way, is that these fossils here, the Australopithecines, Lucy is right there, okay? They're generally thought of as our ancestors, but yet it sure looks to me like they're headed on the way to the chimps. But they're generally lumped into human ancestry, but that's an aside. Let's look at this relatively neat pattern of fossils here and ask what happened then in 2001. Well, another fossil was discovered that initially appeared to fit, at least in the general scheme, but it had such strange features that it really didn't fit the scheme at all, and an expert at the time wrote in Nature that because of that fossil, the evolutionary history of humans is now more complex and unresolved. It now looks set to be thrown into further confusion by the discovery of this new species. The following year, you may have heard about this one, Toomai, the famous Toomai fossil, which in some quarters was touted as the missing link, you know, that finally explains human evolution. It turns out, first of all, it's not where it ought to be in this scheme, and second of all, again, it has features that it shouldn't have to be part of this story. Here's another expert writing in Nature. Toomai plays havoc with the tidy model of human origins, and his prediction was that it is just the tip of an iceberg of a very messy story. Well, this is nothing new. 20 years ago, two paleoanthropologists, two experts wrote, It's a myth that the evolutionary histories of living things are essentially a matter of discovering fossils. If it were true, we could expect that as more hominid fossils, human ancestral fossils, were found, the story of our evolution would become clearer. But if anything, the opposite has happened. So let's ignore all that, okay? Let's pretend none of that happened. The mess is not there. Let's pretend that what we really have is a nice, neat series, just for the sake of argument. We have all the intermediate forms we want. Whether they look like this or not doesn't matter for the sake of the argument. But we have all the intermediates we need, so this could plausibly, this looks more like that, this looks more like that, and so on and so forth, up the line. Let's assume that's what we've got. What does it show us? Well, in Darwinian evolution, we would argue then this evolved into that, and so on and so forth by Darwinian descent with modification. A few years ago, 12 years ago now, an Ohio State biologist wrote a book called Evolution and the Myth of Creationism, obviously an effort to refute arguments against Darwinian evolution. And he explained that this, what I just showed you, is what paleoanthropologists, or experts on human fossils, do. And the evidence, he wrote, is so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by reasonable people. And to illustrate his point, he chose the Corvette. Now, these were not drawn, he used photos, but rather than try to get copyright permission, the illustrator of my book drew her own, and she actually did a better job. Turned out they had one of the models mislabeled, but that's another story too. Anyway, this was the evidence that he said cannot be denied by reasonable people. If you compare a 1953 and a 54 Corvette side by side, and then a 54 and a 55, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. Well, what's really overwhelmingly obvious here? These were all designed. This didn't evolve into that. If you put that in the junkyard and you walk away and come back in a million years, are you going to have that? Not a chance. So that's not what's going on here. What we have here is a series of designed entities. The fact that we can draw a nice, neat line, intermediates from here all the way to there, is absolutely irrelevant to whether what we're dealing with is descent with modification. Critics of Darwinian evolution have taken to calling this Berra's blunder, because, of course, Corvettes are designed. And the lesson from Berra's blunder is that if we really want a succession to show us something, we have to show that a natural mechanism could produce the succession. If we could show that wind and rust and rain could turn this into that, then we would have descent with modification in the Corvette. Similarly, if we could show natural processes that would change an ape-like creature into a human, then we could show descent with modification in animals, in living things. But as we've seen, as I've tried to persuade you anyway, the evidence for this is, as I've said, underwhelming at best. Oops. Since the evidence for Darwin's theory, as I've argued, is so weak, perhaps design, which was the other alternative with the Corvettes, is a reality rather than just an illusion. Remember, Dawkins said it was the evidence that shows us a world without design. Well, the evidence doesn't. I'm turning now briefly to intelligent design theory, and I'll give you a short outline of that, and then I'll conclude, because I really enjoy the question and answer session more than standing up here talking myself. Intelligent design theory, first of all, seeks to understand the logic of design inferences, and I'm going to amplify each of these points in just a minute. Second of all, it asks whether certain features of living things show evidence of design. And third, and this is the most daring and risky of all, it promises to make scientific research more fruitful. First, seeking to understand the logic of intelligent design. William Dembski, who, like me, is certifiably insane because he got 2 PhDs, wrote a book a few years ago called The Design Inference, in which he attempted to tease out the logic by which every single one of us makes design inferences. We do it probably almost every day. We look at something and we try to determine in our mind, now, did that happen on purpose or is it an accident? Did that, is my car window broken and my stereo gone because of the wind or because somebody wanted my stereo? To pick a rather sad example. But design inferences happen all the time. Dembski analyzed the logic of it and concluded and argued in his book and has argued in several subsequent books that the design inference relies on two things, improbability and specification. And here's what he meant by that. If you know the game Scrabble, we have little wooden blocks with letters on them, and you try to make words out of them on the board. If you take a handful of Scrabble letters and you just drop them on the floor, they're going to make a very messy pile, maybe something like this. Now, this is highly improbable. If you don't believe me, try to drop another pile on the floor and make the same thing. This is exceedingly improbable. I don't know what the chances are, but chances are you're going to have to do several million more drops before you come up with anything even close to that. So none of us would call that designed. So the idea that design is merely a conclusion from improbability is simply not true. Look at this, though, a little bit off the bottom of the screen. These same letters arranged to spell an English sentence from Shakespeare. Methinks it is like a weasel. Same letters, maybe the same improbability. But in this case, we have also specification. The letters are lined up to fit a pattern independently of the blocks and the letters, a pattern that we have in English speech, in fact, in Shakespearean literature. So for Dembski, these are the two elements of a design inference, and it's when we have both of these that we make the design inference. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. He's not claiming that the inference is infallible, but it is a logical, legitimate inference, otherwise we couldn't live our lives, and this, he argues, is how we do it. He also argues that this inference can be extended to living things. Now for that, however, we need evidence. Another intelligent design theorist, a biochemist at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, Michael Behe, has written another book, Darwin's Black Box, in which he argues that certain features of living things, in fact, do show evidence of design. By Darwin's black box, by the way, Behe meant that for Darwin, many features of living things were just unknowns. Darwin didn't know about the molecular stuff, and so Behe, as a molecular biochemist, does, and he argues that now Darwin's theory is in much more trouble than it was 130 years ago.